David, what are your concerns with this legislation?
Well, this legislation was one of the most amateur efforts I've seen from a government. I said at the time, I thought it was like drawing in crayons from kids. They brought in legislation. They gave us and others like a 20-minute briefing in the morning, desperately wanting a media statement that it was urgent and it had to be rushed through. And then we said to them, well, why is it urgent? They literally didn't have an answer. We said, who does it apply to? They didn't have an answer. We said, does it apply to the group that came out that were the subject of last year's High Court case? Well, it might, it could, kinda. We said, well, where's the urgency? And when they had no answer at all, that's when we had finally got the numbers to have a very quick inquiry that night. And we had the Secretary of Home Affairs, we had a Labor Assistant Minister there. And again, they'd had like 12 hours to prepare for this. And we said, well, what's the urgency? Why are you trying to ram this legislation through? Again, no answers. They couldn't even tell us who it would apply to. But we did discover that it was potentially giving the minister the power to issue directions to pretty much any non-citizen, anyone on a visa. And then it was also giving the power to blacklist any country on the planet. So literally they're proposing to give the immigration minister the power to blacklist any country and refuse to process any visas from that country without any constraints, without telling us who's on the list, although mentioning Russia, Iran, Iraq and South Sudan, and no constraints and no parliamentary oversight. So when you're talking amateur hour, this was the worst example of amateur hour from a government that was looking like it wants a media hit and then desperately trying to work out what the story was behind it.
Well, it was certainly rushed, 36 hours with no explanation. But on the other end, James, you think that we do need this?
Absolutely. And let's get to the heart of what this legislation says. The government is saying that non-citizens who've exhausted every avenue of trying to remain in the country only to come up short should then cooperate with being deported back to their own country. And if they won't cooperate, then they go to jail. This is entirely sensible legislation. If you don't have a right to be here, and we are a very generous country when it comes to our humanitarian, our refugee, etc., etc. If you don't have a right to be here, then you go home. And if you won't participate in that, you go to jail. To allow people to stay here when they have no right to be here is to violate the rights of Australians. Right now, we have Australian citizens sleeping in tents, living in their cars because they can't find a home. Not only that, to allow illegal residents to stay here when they don't have a right is to undermine the legitimacy of our immigration laws, our border laws. It will only encourage more people to come here if you think, you know what, you can come to this country, you've got no right to be here, but nor will they send you back and they'll let you just continue to live here at taxpayer expense. Well, why wouldn't you risk it and come here just like a boat did over the course of the weekend, the third boat since November?
That is a good point. Do you think then, David, we risk saying we are open, we're back in business, we're going to see more arrivals? What do you think?
Well, hardly. I mean, the fact that there's one bloke wandering about the Kimberleys is no reason to give...
Well, there were 15 Chinese who arrived and 40 who arrived the other day and another boat before that.
It's hardly a reason, James, to give these kind of godlike powers to an immigration minister. And let's be clear what they're proposing. They're proposing, say, for example, a woman from Iran who's here with her kids may have felt a very real sense of being persecuted, fearing being persecuted by a brutal government, but has not had her case accepted by a very, very racist, one-sided immigration assessment system. James may not agree, but it is. Most people say that.
I definitely don't agree that our immigration system is
incredibly biased,
racist.
Incredibly unfair rules. She's had her asylum claim refused. She's now told by the Labor immigration minister, if you don't apply for a visa for you and your kids and go back to Iran and face jail and persecution, we're going to put you in jail for a year.
That's not at all
That is
what's
exactly
happening.
What the law says. And James, let me finish, because you also said people who have exhausted their avenues. There is no requirement for anyone to have exhausted any avenue. It's just anyone on a bridging visa. And we're talking tens and tens of thousands of people on bridging visas. There's another power to expand it to anybody. And to give the immigration minister the power to issue you with a direction. And if you don't do everything he says, you go to jail, mandatory minimum jail for 1 year.
But David, what
Actual
you said
people,
earlier...
godlike powers to people.
That the Australian government would send someone back to Iran knowing that they will face persecution.
They said Iran's on the list.
Iran is...
And Russia, that nice man, Mr. Putin. We're going to send political dissidents back to Russia, and if they don't go, put them in jail.
The point is the Australian government will not send someone back to a country where they know that person is going to be persecuted. We give those kind of people asylum. We're very generous in that. But where those avenues have been exhausted, where there's been found to be no evidence that this person is in danger, they get told to go back to their country. That's entirely reasonable. If someone lobbed at my house with no right to be there, I'd say out, and you would agree. This is just that on a national
All right,
level.
let's